Hello, everybody. I imagine there's not that many of you because actually, part one of this video, I'll stick you a bit of hair, did surprisingly poorly. Not that we're here for the views, we're here for the sheer love of the game. But yeah, I was actually kind of surprised because, you know, everyone loves a bit of Alex O'Connor. People like when I respond to, ex-Christians. But whatever. So basically, as was the case last time, because this is quite a long video, we're going to jump into it right away. We're going to look at, essentially what Rhett McLaughlin has to say about why he's not a Christian anymore. So, slightly bigger. Boom.
Ideas.
Yeah.
But I was like, okay. But I just think that mentality of finding that the people, because it got into biblical scholarship after that. It got into, okay, well, the primeval history. So this is, I guess this is allegory. Like this didn't happen. These are religious myths that were adapted from other myths that were around at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
The flood didn't happen.
Yeah.
The Tower of Babel is a weird explanation for language. I started seeing all that, and so I was like, okay, now my entire view of the beginning of the Bible is different.
So yeah, basically this is where we're at. This is a guy who used to believe a fundamentalist, literalist version of Christianity, and when he found out that was incorrect, it shook his entire faith in Christianity, even though the majority of Christians presently, and probably the majority of Christians historically, although that's harder to say for certain because obviously, you know, there wasn't as much premise or pretense for asking people, but they would have actually thought it was perfectly normal to not take the Bible completely literally.
And again, I would go to the apologetics answer, and I would be like, one person seems to be like, the critical scholars actually seem to be like,
imagine being able to build anything, bring it to life.
Interested in what happened. Like, why did these people write this? Why is it like this? Where did this idea come from? And then the Christian apologists seem to be like, well, we know it's God's word, so how do we prove it?
Mm-hmm.
And it just kept creeping closer and closer to Jesus.
So I will say that this idea of people who have a genuine interest in whether or not something is true or false, or like the facts of something, is a discussion that a point that I've kind of returned back to in a few videos I've made about like the quality of people's arguments, like this idea of, and you notice it a lot with conspiracy theorists, which I suppose is unsurprising, where their entire thing is that they'll bring up like issues with the standard narrative, and what that the actual reality there is, oh, this is interesting, let's look into why this is the case. And that's how you would respond if you were interested in reality, but of course these people aren't. So yeah, basically they're coming at it from a very different perspective.
And I had this, like, this happened, this was years, right? Because I was like, well, I'm not going to stop believing in Jesus. You know, you can have these weird ideas about the Old Testament, but like, Jesus is different. I mean, I have a personal relationship with him, and, you know, and that stuff's true, right? You know, the stuff about the resurrection, my arguments for why the resurrection had happened, and it being the best explanation for the beginning of the church and all this. I'd like had those arguments in my back pocket. But long story short, eventually those arguments fell victim to the same type of critique. They're a little bit different, because I do think that there is a more interesting conversation around the resurrection, because you can kind of know a little bit less about what happened. And you can be somebody who believes all this stuff about that I might agree with related to evolution, but then be like, I have a faith position that Jesus actually rose from the dead. Mm-hmm. I recognize that it's not a scientific thing. I can't prove it. It is a little bit different category.
Well, there's two aspects to it. On the one hand, there is the basic fact, which he's implying there, which is you can't know for a fact that the resurrection account is incorrect. But there's also the fact that there is, in fact, more evidence for the resurrection, in that the accounts of it are far more contemporary with it, in contrast to, for example, the Book of Exodus. Well, the Book of Exodus, traditionally the accounts from it are held by Christians to have been contemporary with it, but secular scholars wouldn't say so. Whereas even secular scholars are willing to say that the Gospels are quite close to the life of Jesus.
But it opened me up to questioning these sacred ideas. And it's just the most sacred idea of all, that Jesus was the Son of God who raised from the dead, eventually was the last domino to fall.
Wow. And how does that finally fall? I mean, because the evolution thing confronts, and I think the reason why it was so scandalous in the 19th century is kind of just a vibe shift, right? Because when you speak to philosophically minded Christians, they will quite correctly say there is no argumentative syllogism you can construct which shows that because animals have a common ancestor, therefore God doesn't exist. That doesn't follow. There's no argument you can make from that. But it's hard to put into words just like the feeling. Again, it's like we were saying before about the indicating a direction of thought. When a society is based upon the idea that human beings are special and unique.
Yeah.
This idea, if you're smart, it doesn't need to undermine the idea that God exists, but it shows this direction of thought, like, oh gosh, we're not as special as we thought we were, and where's that going to lead? I'm pretty sure that in the first edition of The Origin of...
My pausing didn't work there. This idea that evolution shows we aren't as special as we might otherwise think, I don't really agree with that, because the reality is that actually, if there is this whole history of various animals that have all not achieved anything like what human beings have achieved, actually that would imply we're more special. If there is a universe that is hundreds, if not thousands, if not millions of light years across, then that suggests, and as far as we know, there's no other planet that has anything like us on it. That could suggest we are significant and special, and that we are in fact significant and special to a God who exists outside of space and time, to whom vast space and time, incomprehensible space and time for us, is a trivial thing. And like that would be a perfectly consistent understanding of the position of humanity with a full understanding of the significance of, or our place within evolutionary biology and astronomy.
In 1859, that beautiful ending, there is grandeur in this view of life from many different species, whatever it is, having been breathed into many lives or into one, have been and are being evolved. And there's that phrase, like, having been breathed into one or to many, primordial forms of life. And presumably because of the backlash that this idea receives in the second edition of The Origin of Species, having been breathed by the creator into one life or to many, Darwin defaced the ending, his moving ending to The Origin of Species. And I think by edition 3 it was back out again, so you can, I've seen one in person, an actual second edition at like a rare bookshop. If you happen to be in like a fancy rare bookshop and see if they've got a second edition, it will say by the creator, because there's just something so confronting about it that you need to respond to. But okay, there's that, and then there's the resurrection. That's not just like a vibe shift. This is the historical claim upon which Christianity is based. And like you say, it's less accessible to the scientific method because it's a singular event. Yeah. It's not like a process that's still going on today that we can biologically observe. And you can't scientifically or historically prove the resurrection, but you can prove like surrounding facts. You can say that Jesus was crucified, that his disciples claimed to see him, all of this kind of stuff. All of those arguments are still there and still sat in your mind. Presumably you're pretty familiar with them as someone who specializes in outreach. Why would that change? Like what shifts the dial on those kinds of arguments for you?
I believe I did say actually that I would speed this up to 1.2 times speed. I think I did that in the last episode or last install, whatever this is, the first part, because obviously this is quite a long video and we're going to try and get it all done by the end of today. And so far that's not too difficult because I've only had to pause and just say a quick few things. So,
and this is where I don't remember specifically, like, okay, well, it was this book, it was that, but it could be something as simple. It was one aspect of that argument, of that case. Probably the most famous one is, well, why would the disciples die for a lie?
Mm-hmm.
And then when I really looked into that, and then I found that, well, I don't think I can actually historically defend that anyone died for something that they knew to be a lie. Like, I think that this can be explained by them being deceived, right? They could just be wrong about what they saw or their perspective. But I think the bigger...
I would not say that's a very compelling argument at all. I would say one of the big issues of the die for a lie argument, and to be honest, I didn't even realize this until relatively recently, is that we really don't have very much historical evidence for how the disciples died in the first place. That is just a tradition, and it's not necessarily a tradition that can be reliably placed close to the lifetime of the disciples. So really, the main issue there is the premise that the disciples actually did all die for their faith. But if we were to grant that the disciples died for their faith, then I think that would be a pretty compelling argument. And I certainly don't think that saying that they were deceived is a solution to that, because what they claim to have seen in the Gospels is Jesus physically in front of them, having a conversation with them. One of them puts their finger in where the spear went in, puts their finger through the hole in his wrist. Basically, stuff that should make it pretty obvious that, like, that's not something where you can be like, oh, whoops, I misremembered. Like, this is something where if you die for that, either you actually experienced it or you knew that you were lying. And this is why people don't understand the die for a lie argument when they say, well, people die for things they believe all the time. Yeah, sure. But there's a difference between dying for something you believe versus dying for something you know happened. You experienced it happening. And if you didn't experience it happening, you know that you are lying about it. Right? Like, if I die for the belief that I met Elvis Presley in the flesh or whatever, then whatever I'm saying there, it can't be the case that I just have a vague sense that I did. No, there must have been something physical that happened that showed to me that that was an experience I actually had.
Picture was, as I started looking at different perspectives on the historical Jesus, I remember there was one book that was called The Historical Jesus, 5 Views. And I read that book, and I think every one of them was...
Hey, if you want to get across London, you do it by their journey.
Was some kind of Christian.
Yeah,
just sure. Different gradations of liberal or progressive Christian. And everyone laid out their case with a lot of confidence and a lot more scholarship and knowledge than I have about the subject. But it was so gray. And I just started, this feeling began to creep in, which was like, okay, well, maybe he did rise from the dead, but what I've learned about the process of historical investigation, and also just the nature of human psychology and the nature of religious movements and the nature of people's willingness to believe things, like, it began to dawn on me that I don't know exactly what happened with Jesus. I don't know the nature of specifically the nature of his death. Like, was he left on the cross? Was he thrown into a large, like mass grave? Was he put into a rich man's grave by Joseph of Arimathea? Was that invented? I don't know. But what seems to be pretty clear to me is that it's almost certain that there's some explanation for how it all started that isn't that he actually raised from the dead. In my compulsion to believe that he raised from the dead, it is a religious position. It is a faith position.
I think one of the issues here is it depends whether or not, and this is why there's kind of always an issue with atheists and the question of whether you are basically talking about theism in general or Christianity specifically, is that the case for Christianity specifically becomes much more compelling if you are largely persuaded by the broader arguments for theism. for me, I think there are good arguments for theism, and I think there are good arguments specifically for Christianity that could be grounded in a basic theology. And as such, I am willing to look at the gospel accounts as being much more credible. When Rhett is saying there are many other explanations for why we would have this account of Jesus rising from the dead, that is a legitimate objection if you are arguing against the position that Jesus rising from the dead is something that only could have been possible by divine intervention, or the supposed story of Jesus rising from the dead, only possible with divine intervention, therefore God must exist. But if instead what we're talking about is actually we have lots of good reasons to think that a God exists, and these are like the standard arguments, cosmological, teleological, and then also, some other ones. I mean, like people talk about the mathematical argument. There's lots of reasons to think that a God exists. And when you have that foundation, like actually, if that God exists, it's much more credible that Jesus actually did rise from the dead. So essentially, it depends where you're approaching it from. If you're approaching it from the perspective of a complete atheist, of course, there's going to be like an explanation that doesn't require you to believe God exists is going to seem way more credible to you than the explanation that God exists and rose Jesus from the dead. But that doesn't mean that if you have not seen reason to think that a God exists, that actually Jesus rising from the dead is much more credible. And by the way, I'll just say, I was feeling like a bizarre person. I was like, what's happening? Nobody commented. Usually when I start these live streams, there'll be a handful of regular people who all say like, hey, how's it going, guys? Hi, everyone, blah, blah, blah. And, I'll be like, hello, everyone. And this time you're the first person to have replied, and you replied, what, 15 minutes into the live stream? Crazy. But anyway, your presence is very welcome. It's also very strange because when my wife and I went to church yesterday, that none of the other people our age were there. I don't mean like there were only a few. I mean there were none. None of them were there. And we were like, was there like something going on? Like a social thing for the young adults at church that we weren't invited to? Because usually I didn't get a notification. Okay, maybe that's it. That's unfortunate. Yeah, because we definitely got fewer numbers than we usually would. So I don't know. I could try and make a community post just because it would be a shame if there are people who, aren't here just because they weren't even aware it's happening. So I'll make a community post to that effect, just so everyone can know. But anyway, yeah, very confusing. And yeah, now no one else is here. Let's see. So I'll just say, yeah, I can't think of any reason why. So I'll say, hey, everyone, apparently a notification didn't go out alerting people to a live stream starting. Blah, blah, blah. Click. All right. So we'll see. I don't know whether or not people get a notification for that, but we'll see if some more people show up. All right. Yes. Anyway, whatever. The point is that we're not. Oh, hello. What's that doing here? There we go. Yeah, it's not all about the views, as I said. It's just nice to have people there. Yeah. Blake says, same here. No notification. Okay. This is yeah. Is YouTube trying to censor me? Is the man trying to take me down? I can't think. I mean, maybe it was a stupid thing on my end, but I don't think I'm in the habit of accidentally. I don't even know what I would click to turn off people getting notifications. It could just be YouTube being stupid. Anyway, well, interestingly, far more people are now showing up. So welcome, everyone. And of course, if you do want to help these videos get seen by more people, make sure you do hit that like on the way out. If you're here, you're listening to these words right now, it'll take you 5 seconds to just scroll down, hit that like, smash that like button. You know what? I'll show you how it's done because I think this is a perfectly find video, it's an interesting discussion. There you go. That's what you do. You just like, you get a little animation, and that's what we do here because we love people.
It's not an historically defensible position to the degree.
Popped up on my homepage, thankfully. Yeah, I mean, I assume it would be in people's subscription box. Apparently, some people don't check subscription boxes, which is very distressing to me because I use the subscription box all the time. Anyway, we'll get into the video. Sorry, we shouldn't be getting distracted too much.
That these.
Oh, sorry. I actually didn't respond to the thing you said, so I was so distracted by. So, seems like Rhett has issues with persuasion rather than the arguments themselves. Yeah, I mean, it would be interesting to know. It's kind of interesting because he hasn't mentioned in any of this let's say a priori belief in God. Like, he's not at any point engaged with the question of like, why is it that he thought a God existed, and why does he exist, and why does he now not think that? And that's like a very important question here.
Christian apologists make it out to be. We were talking last night about Dale Allison, how I just think I love his book.
He's great.
And this was all like, I read that like 2 years ago. So this is all way after my deconstruction, but I'm still interested in the subject. But, he's a Christian. He believes that it happened. But I think he's got one of the best books on the resurrection. The thing is so refreshing about it is he's not coming at this from like a Gary Habermas standpoint where he's like, this is the most reasonable thing. And if you don't agree with that, you're being unreasonable. Mm-hmm. It's like, well, no, we're talking about the pinnacle of an unreasonable idea, an unreasonable event. This is not, if this happened, this is something I have to accept on faith. And I am completely fine with people who do that. But my intuition is that it didn't happen. And I have sort of lost my ability to have faith in things that are just conjecture and things that something that foundational. Mm-hmm. I mean, I still have what I would call some level of religious faith. We can talk about what that might look like. But I think that my ability to have faith in the idea of the resurrection, it just was like, why would you choose for that to be the thing that you believed in when all these other things have sort of fallen apart?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so obviously he's got that he keeps coming back to that thing of, well, there were these other things which I thought weren't as credible, and therefore I abandoned the resurrection. He says, why would you choose that to be the thing you have faith in? Well, because if that is true, it is the most significant thing ever. Like, at the end of the day, nothing massive hinges on the truth of the opening to Genesis. Whereas if Jesus Christ was God and rose from the dead, that means that all of the theological foundation for the claim the Bible's making about salvation and God's relationship to us and his plan for us, all of that is true if Jesus rose from the dead. So if you think that that is actually quite a compelling theology and that it could be grounded in truth based on whatever it is that inclines you to believe that, then it's definitely worth taking seriously, and perhaps even worth taking a leap of faith and saying, well, even if there's some aspects of it that don't quite make sense to me, I'm going to stick with it. I mean, for me personally, the aspect of the Gospels that never really makes much sense to me is the nativity accounts, just because they're not as they're only explored by two of the Gospels, and they seem to have a few more like apparent historical errors, and they also seem to be much more obviously conveniently constructed to meet certain priorities that the author would have had, and that does give me some cause for doubt. But ultimately, like I say, if it seems like, because you got to bear in mind, it's not the end of the world if the gospel accounts actually do have errors in them, right? Because if someone's done a nice thing for you, and then you find out that the account of them having done the nice thing for you, or let's say there's 4 accounts of them having done nice things for you, and all of them have some errors, but it's errors that aren't directly related to the nice thing they did for you. And even if they are directly related, they don't diminish the nice thing they did for you, and they could be perfectly consistent with the fact these are just 4 people who are all aware this nice thing was done, but they just have different knowledge about it, and some maybe even inaccurate knowledge, that doesn't therefore mean that the nice thing is now not worth anything. Like if there's a guy, well, I don't know why I'm assuming you're a woman, even though probably very few of you are women. So let's say if there is a woman who you really like and you think she's very pretty and attractive and whatever, but maybe you're not completely sold on like the idea that she's the one, and then you hear an account of something she did that's just the greenest of green flags, just something that absolutely makes you think, wow, she is the one for me. The fact she did something like that, the fact she had a Lord of the Rings marathon or whatever. But then the different people you hear that from all give you slightly different accounts. What's more likely, that all of them got together and conspired to make this thing up, or that they're all telling the truth, but like nobody's perfect at remembering something? And the point is, if it's the latter, then you still have every reason to want to pursue this woman like she is the one. And I feel like, the same principle really does apply to what Jesus did for us in the biblical account. Even if, like, I'm not going to be shocked if I actually find out, the Bible is just chock full of errors, because that's not, like avoiding human error was not a fundamental part of what the Bible needs to be. But I would still say that, just to say, there are many historical accounts that have errors in them. That doesn't mean that everything said in them is incorrect.
Process.
Came across an interesting idea. A friend told me. I wish I could remember exactly how this goes, but I'm pretty sure that there is a development as the Gospels go on about the description of the tomb.
When you try something and you think they have thought of actually, they're
so like in Mark's Gospel, presumably, I think it just says that Jesus is put in a tomb. And in Matthew's Gospel, it becomes a new tomb. And then I think by Luke, it's a new tomb in which no one had been laid. Or maybe that's John. I can't remember the details, but there's things that you wouldn't notice that I'd never come across this idea before. If the empty tomb is an important apologetic to Jesus' resurrection, well, we know that the tomb was empty. In order to know that the tomb was empty, you need to ensure that Jesus was probably the only person laid in it, because otherwise it could have been mixed up with someone else or something like this. And so there is this hint at evidence of an early apologetical motive to make the tomb a new tomb, which means there's no other bodies in there, and then specifically a new tomb in which no one had been laid.
Okay, I have one problem with this, and it's this. The issue of anyone who tries to like push this idea of a theological development across the Gospels is it would seem obviously inconsistent and kind of like trying to have your cake and eat it if you're going to argue that the Gospels are so kind of independent of each other that they have contradictions, while simultaneously arguing that the Gospels are in fact so much interacting with each other that they have basically people saying, oh, I'm going to build on that. Because like that's the issue. I would be very surprised if Alex wouldn't be the kind of person who would try to argue that the fact that we have different individuals mentioned as being the first ones to identify that the tomb was empty, and seemingly even actually different events happening, he would probably look at that and say, oh, this is a contradiction, this is an issue. But I don't see how you can possibly believe that, let's say, for example, Luke read Mark, read Matthew, and then said, all right, well, I think it's a bit of an issue that these guys haven't really stressed the fact that the tomb was definitely empty. So I'm going to make sure in my gospel, I'm going to really stress that the tomb was empty. But I'm also going to write a whole load of stuff about who was at the tomb that totally obviously contradicts, again, according to atheists, contradicts what was in the Gospels before me. Like if you think, like, again, it just doesn't really make sense that you can think these people were so motivated to construct a narrative that made Christianity seem as credible as possible using their knowledge of the Gospels that had been before as a direct reference for like, this is what we need to kind of amp up, but simultaneously failed to like think, oh, and also maybe I should make sure my story is totally consistent with them. It just doesn't really work. I really don't know what to think about how directly from God the Bible is. Direct word seems unlikely. Maybe it was a guiding thing, and maybe some parts are entirely human written. Brackets, is that heresy? No, I wouldn't say that's heresy at all. So I would say that it's if anything more heretical to say that it's his direct word. I don't think that because that is basically what Muslims believe about the Quran. And for me, I would say ultimately the best way of understanding it is providence, that essentially it's mostly a human thing with God working behind the scenes, just like he's doing, for many other things that happen in the Bible. I think it would make sense that consistent with that, the construction of the Bible itself was God working behind the scenes, but humans doing what humans do. And as for the other thing I'll just say on sort of like gospel development, Alex is a big fan of the idea that like John stresses the divinity of Christ in a more exaggerated way than the prior gospels. And basically, for those who don't know, essentially what he's actually doing is stressing the divinity of Christ in a more gentilic way, because to a Jewish audience, the divinity of Christ would have been obvious right from the Gospel of Mark. But to a audience who didn't have the same Jewish preconceptions of what God was and what it meant to be God, they wouldn't have read Mark and immediately picked up that Jesus was God. So that's why John wrote the gospel in the way he did, where he includes way more of the references to things Jesus did that made it clear he was God.
Right.
So that when they say there's an empty tomb, nobody can come along and say, well, are you sure it wasn't somebody else, or someone stole the body, or it got lost or something? No, it has to be an empty tomb. So you're right that when those little questions, are we sure that he was taken down from the cross and laid in the tomb in the way that it's described? And if you start to notice apologetical motivations potentially in those very stories, it starts to undermine the historicity a little bit. Like how Matthew's gospel is the only one that mentions the guards at the tomb.
Right.
And we're told why the guards, like we're told by Matthew essentially why he's included the story of the guards, because they are like, Jesus is gone. And the Jews pay the guards and say, you're going to spread the rumor that the body got stolen. That's what you're going to do. And the guards are like, sure thing, we'll do that. We'll take that money. And this is a rumor that still persists to this day, says Matthew.
Yeah. And what's the best explanation for that?
Is it like there were actually guards and Matthew is the only person who happened to report them? Or has Matthew invented the guards as an apologetical tool, admitting that there is this rumor that the body was stolen and thereby having to invent the guards at the tomb to protect against that?
I mean, this kind of gets into the not die for a lie argument, but the question of why would someone, this was back in the day, paper wasn't cheap, right? Why would someone go to all of the effort to write this story about a guy and then basically knowing at the same time that you are literally making this up? And bear in mind, Matthew, he wasn't like making money off of this. We don't have any evidence that this was like Matthew then started a cult and made got some personal benefit from this. So I don't see why you would think that he would invent a story of these guards knowing they weren't actually there. Now, to be fair, this is another example where it could be human error. Like maybe it's the case that somebody at one point said, there were probably basically maybe there were some Roman guards who were saying Jesus, actually was stolen from the tomb or whatever. And someone's like, oh, it's probably just some Jews who paid him to say that. Like somebody kind of speculated that, and maybe that got in. And that would be an example where, it's possible, because ultimately we know that the gospel writers were using human methods. Maybe this is something that got in, not because anyone really knew it was a lie, but because what became speculation of, oh, this is probably what happened, then became, I heard from so-and-so that this is what happened. And then Matthew is then talking to us about, okay, so that's what happened. That's like a possibility. I think that's much more likely than this idea that Matthew was like, I'm going to make up this whole detail completely on my own. Then somehow still act as if I think the Bible's credible.
Maybe there were guards. We can't prove that there weren't. But when you start to see how much potential apologetical motivation is underlying these claims in these gospels, which, although broadly seeming to be attempts at historical biography, are also just full of what is probably best thought of as mythical storytelling, becomes really difficult. Dale Allison talks at length about the raising of the graves in Matthew's gospel at the time of Jesus'
which
death.
is bonkers.
It's absolutely bonkers. But it's really strange how it's worded as well, because it says that when Jesus dies, it says at that moment when he dies, there's a great earthquake and all the graves open, and the holy ones of Jerusalem appear to people after the resurrection. And it's really
You need to know the truth about alien donkeys.
really weird, clunky wording, because it says that the graves opened when Jesus died, but then it said that the people appeared to many after the resurrection, as if like they were just laying dead in the open tomb for 3 days or something. Like, it's weirdly worded, and you've got this, and Matthew's the only one who reports it, and you've got this undertone of Jesus being the firstborn of the dead, and it's like, okay, like Dale Allison is pretty convinced this didn't actually happen. It's another question whether Matthew thought it happened,
right?
But the problem is that if Matthew didn't, this is just a bit of myth that Matthew is obviously telling some kind of allegorical story. What does that mean? It means that Matthew is willing to make up stories about resurrecting people from the dead in order to serve a theological
If it happened
point.
once.
And then the floodgates are open, especially because Matthew's gospel is the earliest gospel that has any post-resurrection appearance that's recorded in it. Boom, the doors are open.
Yeah. Well, the thing that's so fascinating to me about this is, famously, evangelical Christians, especially when I was coming up in campus ministry, like we had our anti-Mormon arguments.
Oh yeah.
Right. There was this one summer that.
So, I mean, well, obviously, kind of as I already said, there's no evidence that anybody made mad bucks from Christianity early on, or had a whole harem of wives. There's no evidence of anyone, to my knowledge, personally enriching themselves off of Christianity early on. And you would think there would be some kind of argument there. Or like if someone was aware of that, considering how people dislike Christianity, they would have said that. But no, it seems like almost miraculously early on in Christianity, every single person going into it seems to have legitimate motivations, except for the kind of scummy false prophets who we're only told about from Paul, right? Like, it seems like the only people who are identified as not having wholesome motives are those who were in contradiction to Christianity. And of course, obviously I bring this up because they're now going to talk about Mormonism. In the case of Joseph Smith, he very obviously advantaged himself with his so-called discovery. I mean, there's many reasons why Mormonism isn't particularly credible, but the fact that and of course, similar thing to Muhammad, right? Like Muhammad was much better off as a prophet of God than he was before then. And it doesn't seem like you can argue that for any of the early apostles. Not a takedown argument, but it's funny, one of the most patriarchal societies in human history completely vindicate female accounts of seeing Jesus alive. Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's kind of another aspect of this, that the earliest witnesses to Jesus were women, which would have been contrary to the historical expectations of the time. Thank you.
Some Mormon missionaries, like I was out of the country doing some missionary work, and Link was still in Raleigh, and there were Mormon missionaries that came to talk to him. They ended up coming back like 4 or 5 times because Link, at that time, especially at the time, wasn't controversial, it wasn't confrontational. He was just like, yeah, you guys. So they went through the whole spiel or whatever. And then when I got back, I was like, you let them come like 5 times? You didn't never challenge them? He was like, well, I was just kind of waiting. I ended up writing this like pamphlet. I would do this all the time. I would write like little papers or pamphlets or whatever. And there was one that was like, this is what you need to say the next time the Mormons come to your door, right? Because you can take apart their theology and their history in a much, it's so recent, right? So that was my perspective.
Sorry, go to that.
And I find it so interesting that the average Christian apologist, the level of scrutiny they apply to criticizing Mormonism, if they would just for a moment turn that level of scrutiny on their own story, you'd be like, guys, come on, do you see what you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, this is simply an idea I just don't really buy. I'm less interested in Mormonism as the obvious point of comparison, and much more interested in Islam. I just think it's unambiguous that Islam is way more historically suspect when you look at, obviously how late the accounts of Muhammad's life and the, early scripture, if you like, for Islam, how that is actually not very early at all. And even the earliest parts of it contain accounts that are suspect. And, for example, the satanic verses is heavily attested in early accounts, but then Muslims deny that. So there's an inconsistency there. There's also, of course, you have stories of like Uthman burning early Qurans that didn't agree with him. I think when a Christian says, hey, Muslims, if you turned the same level of skepticism on your own religion that you have for Christianity, you would stop being Muslim. And like that's undeniable. When you look at how much Muslims like desperately want to believe that the Bible is corrupted, if there was any account of some early Christian burning a load of early biblical texts because they didn't agree with the official version he wanted to promote, they would lose their mind. They would be like just kissing that black rock or whatever it is, like going mental, praising Allah all day. Like they would, like that would be like insane for them. That would be the greatest thing that has ever happened to them in the history of their polemic against Christianity, that they could say, look, we have proof that a Christian burned a load of Bibles because they didn't agree with his official version. But that's exactly what we know is true of Islam, that there was one of the early caliphs in Islam burned a load of Qurans because they didn't agree with his version. By the way, I say early, we're talking about someone who predates the Hadith. So they predate the earliest substantial accounts we have of Muhammad's life. So you kind of got like, it's that kind of balance, right? Of how are you actually going to play this? Are you going to say oh, well, Uthman doing that, it's not really early. It's not seriously damning because by that point, like everyone would have known or whatever. Or are you going to say, actually, the Hadith are basically contemporary with Muhammad's life? You can't have it both ways because one of them, like the one that you want to say is trustworthy, happened after the one that you want to say basically doesn't really matter and isn't worth talking about as significant to the early development of Islam. And that's what I always come back to. And to me, like this balance. And I actually feel like Christianity is the religion that comes out of that balancing act best off. And it's kind of, my attitude is completely the opposite to this, that when you compare Christianity to other religions and say, well, let's imagine applying equal levels of skepticism to all these religions, that's when you realize, wait, hold a minute, this doesn't make sense. Christianity is so much more credible than all these other religions. I mean, that's the other thing, right? Yeah, Allah did a pretty bad job with Jesus. Imagine sending a prophet meant to spread your message, and instead they end up all worshipping him. Lol. Yeah, like that's the other thing. And I mean, the big criticism I always make of Islam is the fact that they have no reason, just to like pivot, because I think this is important to understand, because obviously one of the things that Rhett has said in this video is, well, how can you claim to know that Islam is false while you're saying Christianity is true? So I think it's just worth taking a brief moment to recognize that on almost every single level that you can do a direct point of comparison between Christianity and Islam, Christianity comes out the more credible. And one example of that is Muslims have no reason to think that Jesus is a reliable Messiah. And essentially, and again, this is an example of kind of that, the balancing act where Christianity ends up kind of in the good position, because the Jewish belief is that the Messiah is basically a one and done situation. He'll show up, he'll lead the Jews to victory against their enemies, and he'll be very happy, well done, the end. And then obviously what they would then say is, well, Christianity, that doesn't make sense because Jesus showed up, but he didn't lead the Jews to victory, blah, blah, blah. But of course, what we would then say as Christians is actually two things. One, a lot of the accounts of the Messiah in the Old Testament seem to show him as someone who's humble and is defeated. And that obviously doesn't gel with what we're told. And the other thing is that actually he did achieve something incredible when he achieved this spiritual victory over death. And that actually, again, lines with when you see in the Old Testament, God talks about the fact that he will circumcise people's hearts. He'll basically give them a heart of flesh rather than a heart of stone. So this idea that actually the victory is going to be had in winning people's hearts and minds, and that works perfectly with the story of Jesus. The Christianity took over the world without having to spill any blood. It did spill blood. That's undeniable. But I do not believe for a second that Christianity needed to spill blood, because even, obviously Bart Ehrman, who I'm sure these two gentlemen are both a big fan of, has said that Christianity would have become the dominant religion of Europe, even if it had continued to be persecuted by the Roman Empire. That's how powerful it was. And that wasn't through physical violence, through state, institutional authority, or anything like that. It was just through it changing hearts and minds. So we would then say, actually, that's an incredible thing Jesus achieved. And that gives us a lot of reason to think, because Jesus achieved something incredible the first time he came, we can still believe when he comes again, he will have the ultimate victory. And then you've got Islam, where we would say as Christians, hey, your Jesus, the Messiah, pretty crap, right? Like, he didn't, like, what did he achieve in Islam? Nothing. He showed up and, according to Muslims, told people to be Muslim, told people to worship one God, and then was killed somehow. Somehow he was killed by a load of Jews who were monotheists. That's a bit weird, but whatever. He did that. And then, of course, as you have pointed out, his followers then immediately start worshipping him, preaching him. And that's the problem. If that is your view of the first, and it's kind of the other issue with any sort of syncretic religion, where they try to just take a whole load of stuff that came before and fan fiction it. The problem is you fail to understand why that stuff happened in the first place. The reason why Jesus had the whole resurrection and then the promise of a second coming stuff, there's a massive theological significance to that you lose when you just say, actually, yeah, Jesus came to preach Islam and then died, or obviously some of them believe that in fact he was just disguised and he didn't really die. Like, he managed to escape and get away with it. But basically disappeared. And upshot is, didn't achieve anything. But he's coming back. And, isn't it great that Jesus is coming back? It just completely undermines everything. And this is just one example of many of how you have this kind of relationship between these three Abrahamic faiths. And you've got the Jewish one, which is kind of deficient in that it's not understanding all of the complexity of what, and the kind of multifaceted meaning of what the Old Testament is presenting. And then you have the Muslim one, which is basically so far departed from the meaning of the Old Testament that they're now just making up their own totally random story that has no basis for them to have any confidence in it. And then you have Christianity in the middle, which is this perfect, and that's why I'm inclined to say miraculous, combination of a new spin on what the Jews would have thought about the Old Testament, but something that constantly lines up with it on every single point. I've always thought that the historical evidence of Christianity is pretty much as good as it could be, considering the resources available to early Christians. I mean, yeah, that's a very good point. That and obviously people point out that even historical figures like Julius Caesar and stuff like that, we don't have that many contemporary accounts of their lives.
Or and if you had been born in a Muslim country and you were of the Muslim faith and you didn't believe that Jesus actually raised from the dead, what would your Muslim apologetic about the resurrection be like?
Okay, so wow, well done, praise God. I literally have already addressed that. This idea that there's just some equivalence where everyone's just making up their own ideas is just not credible. I'm afraid I really need to go to the loo. You'll have to excuse me for one moment. Okay, I tried to be very quick there. Reacting to what Rom510 left his chair. Hello, Matsumura. I think I've seen you here before, but you're not a regular commenter, so I'm glad all it took was me leaving to, help me out here.
Do you really think these arguments are strong, or is it just you need them to be true?
Yeah.
It's so foundational to who you are. You need this to be true. But the second aspect of it is like, we're sitting here having this conversation in the context of 2025, where we have access to all this scholarship. And all this scholarship and all these discussions about these issues are such a recent phenomenon that, first of all, the tiny minority.
Make sure to give the video a like, Matsumura, before you leave. There are 9 people watching right now, so I better see 9 likes on this video. Right now, I can see 1 like. Now, let me just refresh, because I refuse to believe... Okay, there's 8 likes. That's actually not so bad. All right, that's good. Apparently there are 9 people watching. So one of those people... Oh, and now it's gone down to 8. Never mind. All right. You're off the hook, guys. But yeah, if you're watching and you haven't given a like, do it.
Minority of people who live today, who call themselves Christians, care about this stuff and actually take time to think about it, right? You believe that Jesus rose from the dead if you're a Christian, probably because your parents told you. Like 90% because your parents told you. And then you got into a movement where it's continually confirmed by people who come in and they say something.
Yeah, so I've kind of already addressed this thing before. Like, it's a weird thing for me to engage with, because I am not a Christian because my parents told me. And in fact, I did look at Christianity, directly contrasting it with Islam, with Mormonism, with Judaism, with Catholicism. And I was like, oh, wait, one of these ideas makes way more sense than any of the other ones, and for a variety of reasons in different cases. But the reasons why I'm not any other religion, well, any other major religion, because there are really tiny religions where my kind of default argument for why I'm not one is, well, I feel like the true religion would have slightly more impact rather than being totally irrelevant. But yeah, for all the major religions, I could come up with at least 5, and this is kind of a little project that I'm working on the side, at least 5 reasons why I'm not a believer in those religions for all of them. And for most of them, the hard part is only limiting it to 5. And in fact, all of those reasons would be very substantial and ultimately several reasons in themselves. So, and by contrast, like the reasons why I have doubts about Christianity, they are all so minor. And for me, like even when I was an atheist, I was always kind of like, I'm not sure. I feel uncomfortable with the fact that there are so many issues for atheism that I just don't really have an answer to, like the cosmological argument, like the teleological argument. And that's not to say that I wasn't convinced of atheism, I was, but actually, as a Christian, I find myself feeling less of there's like loads of issues I have arguments to. Basically, almost all of the major issues I have arguments to are very specific textual, scholarly criticisms. And those are not nothing, but they are so specific. And it's like, by contrast, I would feel much worse if I was having to argue against Islam. But like every single argument against Islam I could give was, well, the exact description of this tomb kind of implies that the authors had a insincere motivation for it or whatever. Like, notice, like, what was my criticism of Islam? Like, literally their entire concept of Jesus as a Messiah makes no sense whatsoever. It just doesn't. Like, they just don't understand what it even means for Jesus to have been the Messiah. So they don't have any concept of, like, the significance of that. And imagine if, by contrast, I was just left saying, well, the problem with Islam is that when you look at like the different authors, it seems like maybe they had certain priorities that probably suggest they weren't really trying to find, like, that's not nothing, but it is clearly a much less impactful and persuasive argument than your religion is just totally off base on some really key stuff. And that is not a criticism someone can make Christianity. There is no criticism of Christianity I've heard that amounts to your religion just totally misses the mark on this really important thing. Every single argument against Christianity I've heard that is remotely compelling is a very niche scholarly criticism. And that's fine, but it's just not nothing. I remember you said that Hinduism is the second most likely religion, and you'd probably be that if Christianity didn't exist. I don't think you elaborated. Yeah, for me, I think that it's it's mostly just because if Christianity isn't true, then that means that the gospel message of God loves you so much that he'd rather die than be in heaven without you, and that God did all the work, that goes out the window. And to me, that's very compelling. But then what I would have to say is, well, and look, obviously I'm going to like mention what is a compelling idea to me. Obviously, just because something's a compelling idea doesn't mean it's true. There are other considerations as well. But, of course, I'm just trying to answer this as an aside. So this is my answer to that as an aside, bearing in mind, I'm just focusing on one specific thing, and I'm not saying that's the entirety of why I have this position. But the one thing I'm going to talk about is why Hinduism is more compelling to me. I think that if you have basically the alternative to Christianity, which is that there is something we must do, that we must work to earn our salvation, I think that Hinduism has the most compelling account of what that would look like, where essentially, and kind of a big part of Hinduism is this idea that like divinity runs through the universe, and that by connecting ourselves mentally and spiritually with the universe itself, we are accessing a degree of divinity. And the nature of the physical world is that it keeps cycling in perpetuity, and the actual goal is to achieve a divine essence, which is to go beyond the immanence of constant repetition to the transcendence of going beyond that cycle. Like, to me, I think that makes more sense in terms of being compelling, as opposed to so many other religions, which are basically, there's a load of random rules that you have to follow, and basically there's kind of like a seesaw, and if you've done enough of the good deeds, then you like get through or whatever, and if you've done too many of the bad deeds, then you have a bad outcome or whatever. I feel like with Hinduism, the idea that the ultimate goal is going towards some kind of enlightenment and perfection makes sense. I suppose like the similarity between Christianity and Hinduism in that sense is both of them about the idea that ultimately the only standard that achieves the end goal is perfection. And that's in contrast to Judaism and Hinduism, and to an extent Catholicism, where like Catholicism has a concept of I guess for them, like, the end goal is via purgatory, I suppose. But this idea that you get to the end and you are judged as worthy of like the grand prize based on your works, even though your works are actually woefully deficient in many areas. By the way, Wood Lion Gaming, you are new. Hello there. Welcome. Unless I don't believe I've ever seen a comment from you before, and I'm always inclined to welcome new people. So, the more I learn about the Bible and any historical events that coincide with it, the more my beliefs are reinforced. Yeah, absolutely. To this end, I would recommend there is a tour that you can do at the British Museum. Of course, the British Museum, I've said before, I really think it should be called maybe the British Imperial Museum, or like, frankly, just the International Museum. Because the funny thing about the British Museum is it doesn't have anything British in it, which I'm not like saying, oh, you can't still, like, the reality is like lots of countries have museums of things in them, like exhibits from other countries. Like, there's plenty of Egyptian stuff that is in the Berlin Museum. So, and unfortunately, that was destroyed in a lot of the bombing, which sucks. Anyway, that's why Berlin. Like, everyone always, the one thing you can say is at least with the British Museum, we're able to kind of like keep it safe. Whereas you look at like most of the other places where artifacts have been, they've been destroyed in some kind of horrible war. I mean, I suppose by that logic, really, the United States should be the ones who have all of the important artifacts, because they're probably, or like Canada, to be fair, because they're the least likely to have any serious issues. Anyway, yes, I'm very glad that you are commenting for the first time, Woodline. Yeah, basically, sorry, that was a tangent, and I'm acting like we don't have a significant amount of video to get through, so we'll abandon the tangents once I'm done with this. I just want to say essentially that there's a whole section in the British Museum dedicated to the ancient Near East, and the amount of opportunities there are to just go through the exhibits that show the literal story of history that's been like dug up, and you can just perfectly line that up with the Bible. Like the Bible says this battle happened, and they've actually like gone to the place where that battle is supposed to have happened and found exactly evidence of the battle happening as the Bible said it would have happened. So yeah, that's a very reassuring. If you worry about the historicity of the Bible, it's mostly, I will say, it mostly relates to kind of from the book of Judges through to the book of Ezra, Nehemiah. That section is what is really backed up by the historical record. And of course, mostly what we've spoken about in these two parts is kind of the Torah, the early part of the Bible, and then the Gospels, which slightly different, but yeah.
Smart stuff about it, and this is why you can trust it. So even if it did happen, it doesn't feel like a really penetrating investigation into the historical circumstances is what's going to like, make it click and be like, oh, it did happen. I looked under the last rock of history and I found the resurrection. Like, it doesn't seem like God intended for that to be the way. If
that's right.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's, yeah, right. Well done. That is correct. I think that it has to be, I mean, yeah, like the spiritual reality, or like the spiritual dimension of how someone should come to faith in Christ is something, again, I don't have time to get into because we want to finish this video now. I've only got half an hour left, and there is there is more than half an hour of the video left, so we'll see. Hopefully there might be a section I can skip.
It's clearly some sort of, this is a revelation. This is like, this is a secret. This is like God's secret information that you can choose to believe in, and then your life is transformed. Like, I'm okay with people who frame it in that way. I'm like, well, I still think that I think this is a psychological phenomenon. I don't believe it. I'm a skeptic in that regard, but I just find it so interesting the way that some of these apologists go so hard on trying to prove it. It's like, do you really think that that's gonna be the thing that changes somebody's mind?
Yeah, I mean, it's not like it's what Jesus was doing.
No,
verily I say unto you, premise one.
Yeah, he wasn't doing apologetics.
It doesn't work like that. It's clearly like not what it's all about.
Right.
And apologetics can only take you so far. I mean, there is this idea online in particular that...
Yeah, I mean, so things, I'll just say here, like the balances, in some sense, this is true. The thing that I would say it has to come down to is humility. Like that's all there is to it. Like, if you were to ask me, what is the thing that the main thing that is stopping Alex O'Connor from becoming Christian? I'm not going to say anything about Rhett. I don't know Rhett as well, but I've seen a lot of stuff from Alex O'Connor, and I've seen like the videos where he's spoken about like wanting to be Christian. I would say the main thing is that he wants to be a very smart person. Like, I think Alex clearly wants to be seen as an incredibly intelligent, intellectual, academic individual. And the issue with that is he's quite right. You're not going to become a Christian by intellectualizing yourself into it. You have to, I think, fully confront and meditate on the significance of what God did when he came down as a man, lived a perfect life, and died on the cross. And from that, you can then understand the like compelling reasons to actually be a Christian and think it's true. And that's the one thing I want to stress. You don't want to go down the Jordan Peterson route of thinking this is all just a metaphor. This is all just something that we experience the spiritual implications of, but there's no truth to it whatsoever. Which, yeah, so that's dangerous. You want to kind of have the two things interplaying with each other.
To be a Christian.
And there are, by the way, like apologetic arguments made in the Bible, and like academic intellectual arguments. Obviously, Paul makes a point of like saying, hey, the foundation for our faith is that Jesus Christ physically rose from the dead.
Yeah. Or to be religious is to
give detailed feedback that your grammar
essentially do natural theology is what they call it, which is like arguing for the existence of God. Like, the whole religion discussion has become consumed with God's existence, biblical scholarship, and we forget that it's actually an assumption, and a controversial assumption, that is the approach to have to this conversation. For many people, like, natural theology is just a waste of time and an improper approach to the question of God's existence. And most people who have a religious experience will report that. Thomas Aquinas famously didn't finish the Summa Theologica, the greatest Christian metaphysician of all time. And he doesn't finish it because he's performing mass, he's performing the Eucharist, and he has a religious experience.
Right.
And his like friend or colleague or whatever is like writing to him, begging him, you have to finish this, Thomas. Like this is, you've got to finish. And he says, I can write no more. It's all straw compared to what I've seen. And you're right about the double standard as well. I just had a Mormon on my show, Jacob Hansen, who one of the key things that he likes to emphasize, he doesn't usually speak to atheists. This is quite funny. I saw him recently, and he says he doesn't usually speak to atheists because there are so many like metaphysical assumptions you have to make. If you want to talk about Mormonism, you already sound absolutely mental. If you're talking to someone who doesn't even already believe in like
yeah, this is kind of where I come from. My attitude towards Christianity, and this would be my more kind of direct advice to someone who wants to like think, how do I actually become Christian? The first thing I would say is assume Christianity is true. It's the first thing. Just assume it's true. And then get into a discussion on the nitty-gritty of theology. Get into like, and when I say theology, I don't mean like reading the Summa Theologica. I mean the Bible, and start thinking, what would I actually believe about this book if I was compelled to believe it was the word of God? And what you will then find is that there is a much more intricate and deep message there than you would have realized if you were approaching it trying to simultaneously engage with it while also trying to like have arguments with people about whether or not many of its fundamental premises are even true. And that's why, yeah, me personally, I said in my Discord, which you may be aware I have, although I don't think I link it in my description, but I do have a Discord. I recently said, like, I just don't talk to Muslims. And the reason why is because, like, I just think they're so off base. I mean, I kind of already said with, like, the Messiah stuff, like, they don't even know what the Messiah is. And for me to have a conversation with them is just no way it's going to be productive. And similarly, in the case of atheism, I wouldn't say they're, like, as ignorant and as just completely hopeless as far as the intellectual stuff is concerned. There is the fact they are just coming at it from so many different angles that or like axioms that are at odds with mine that it's very difficult to have a conversation about it.
Angels and God and stuff, you're not going to move an inch. But he's like, I always talk to Christians because they do believe in angels and revelation and prophets and all this kind of stuff. And he can kind of like hold up a mirror to these Christians because they look at him and be like, oh yeah, so like, you know, God spoke to some dude in upstate New York through some like golden plates that like no one's ever seen. Yeah, and he's like, yeah, well, how many witnesses do you have to the resurrection that left any accounts? Right. Like, we've got more eyewitness testimony to the golden plates than you've got to the resurrection, you know? And it's this like, obviously I can look at this and think both of them are, you know, not quite hitting the mark.
Right.
But his big gripe is like, I don't mind people saying that we don't have enough evidence or you're not convinced or whatever, but as a Christian, you can't switch that off when it comes to analyzing your own faith. And it does sound absurd to be like, oh, there was a prophet in New York, was there? But we've only just got used to the idea that religion comes from, you know, that comes from the Middle East. The whole reason why Jesus is born of Nazareth is like a lowly origin. They even say in the Gospels, you know, is he the guy from Nazareth? You know, what good comes from Nazareth? We're just used to it now. But at the time, that would have sounded about as crackpot as saying, you know, this guy in upstate New York, yeah, he's found some golden plates and they're buried under the ground.
Yeah, so this is also why you need to be able to understand the idea that certain theologies just make more sense. And I think like part of that is also getting in touch with your own sense of humanity. Because that's the other thing. If you cannot read the Bible and where it says that we need to be radically transformed by God in order to be able to even be in the presence of his like surpassing beyond all possible human understanding holiness, if you cannot read that and be like, yeah, that makes sense, then I don't think you fully understood your own human nature. And that's another thing you need to understand, because that's like the issue with Mormonism in part, is that it thinks that just by like doing your own effort, you can literally become like God. And I just can't believe anyone's like genuinely been honest with themselves about what human beings are actually like and thought about what a god would be like, and come to the conclusion, yeah, I think we could, like, you know, it would take some effort. We'd have to really bone up, but yeah, I think we could get there eventually.
And so I do find, like, I've talked about Mormonism a lot recently because
that's a really good point, Massimiro. Yeah. So the total thematic disconnect and lack of continuity from the Old and New Testament. That's the main issue of Mormons. I mean, the question I would always ask is why? Like, why be a Mormon? Because I think the question, why be a Christian rather than a Jew? I think there are loads of answers to that question. I don't see any real argument for all the things that claim to be like, hey, here's my new updated version of Christianity 2.0. Yeah, but why? Right? You have to have a really compelling argument for that.
I do find it holds up this interesting mirror to Christian apologetics. Yeah. It's like, this is kind of how you sound, guys, a lot of the time.
Yeah, I certainly agree. And to have been on that side of it, and to, I mean, I don't still have that document that I wrote, the guide to talking to your Mormon friends.
That is a shame. I was going to ask.
I mean, it might be in some, box somewhere, but I can tell you that it was incredibly dismissive. And I think that I was trying to be cute and funny at the same time. And so I'm sure I was like essentially saying, can you believe that people believe this? Like, if you only knew how crazy this set of beliefs was, you would basically deny it on that, the fact of how crazy it was. But it's like, it's not any crazier. It's just less familiar. It's just less familiar than these things that we believe so wholeheartedly.
Polygamy might be appealing, but they don't do that anymore. Appealing to you. So you're my. I do have a woman. I forgot. Yeah, I knew I had a woman in this chat. Yeah, I would imagine. I know that I mean, that's kind of the other really interesting thing about Mormonism. There's like there's this TV show something called Escaping Polygamy, and it's basically about Mormon wives in these cults who obviously are like just treated like property, and like they need to escape. And like that's kind of a awkward situation where basically it's just commonly accepted that the state of being that your religion says, yeah, this is how it should be, is recognized by other people to be like, no, this is something you need to escape.
Heartedly. Yeah, but at the time, I mean, you can't see it. When you're in it, you can't see it.
Yeah, of course. You said at the time you said you started believing in natural selection and your wife's in tears. Does that like put you off? Do you think, oh gosh, maybe I shouldn't dig any further? Is it already an unstoppable force? Like, how does that go? Because presumably she's kind of okay with the evolution thing now. So
she's more than okay with it. At this point.
Like how does that like begin to develop? Do you just kind of keep going and say like, sorry, darling, but this is what I think, and there's nothing I can do about it?
Yeah, it moved very slow because, again, I didn't have all these YouTubers talking about this stuff. I had to make the decision to be like, I'm going to buy this book and take the time to read it. And I'm still like living my life. I'm not like a
Mormonism is kind of like white dude Islam. Yeah, basically. I mean, yeah, I don't really. I mean, that's the other thing about like Mormonism. There's not just a question of like why be a Mormon as opposed to a Christian, but also like why be a Mormon as opposed to a Muslim? Like, what is the big benefit that Mormonism has? Like, that's to me like one reason why I find Christianity so compelling is because it's just an obvious question to ask, and it's such an obvious question. It's the main question atheists ask, right? Why be this religion as opposed to any other? And for most religions, the answer is like what? Like, if someone says, I mean, like, this is the issue of paganism, right? Someone says, why worship Zeus instead of Thor? What answer are you going to give there? Oh, I think Zeus is a cooler beard. I like when he turns into a swan and bangs women. Like, what's your like actual? Oh, I think the Marvel movies are crap. So like, there's no argument that you can really make there. But it's similar. Like, if someone says to me, like, if you get a Mormon and a Muslim in a room together, it's like, okay, you both believe in like this guy who like came along and claimed to get like a special message from God directly. You both believe in Christianity, but you believe things that are like contrary to it. Like, you have all these like really kind of, you're very similar in a lot of ways. You both have polygamy. Why is it that you're not the other person? why? And to me, the fact that religions are so similar would be like, make it kind of silly. Whereas if someone said to me, all right, Michael, you're a Christian, why aren't you, and then literally insert any other religion, I'd be like, because my religion preaches that my God is so perfect that he came down to earth as a person and showed us how to live a perfect life. And he took upon himself the punishment for sin, which is death. And he did that so that in having received that punishment, despite being morally perfect and never sinning, he could transfer his, like, my guilt onto himself. And that is just such a radical message in terms of like the amount of love and mercy it would speak to, that God did that. Like, that is totally, like, there's nothing that even comes close to that in any other religion. And I don't see what response someone could give to that.
A voracious reader. I mean, I read quite a bit, but it's, it's pretty slow.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm
like, for the record, you could say, oh, that doesn't prove it's correct. Like, obviously that doesn't prove it's correct. But you couldn't say like, oh, that leaves totally open the question of why does this religion stand out to you over any other? Like, it would kind of make it stupid to ask the question, why are you a Christian as opposed to any other religion? Because the answer is like, well, because they're totally different religions. Whereas by contrast, like I say, with Mormonism and Islam, you can't really make that case as credibly.
Link and I are trying to build a career, and we're trying to like make ends meet. And this is early days of YouTube. So I was a bit scared of where this might lead. And I think I just had this idea, because again, where we come from, everyone else in our families are not just Christians, but they're strong.
Imagine being able to build an app with your name and
committed.
I think we have to skip the how Rhett's deconstruction impacted his life. Obviously, I'm sure it's a very interesting discussion, but I really don't want to be, taking up too much time when we got, in theory, we're finishing this in 13 minutes. So let's see. We'll look.
So now, what's your relationship to Christianity like? I mean, you said you read Dale Allison's book like 2 years ago. That's no like, easy bedtime reading. You've got to still have some kind of interest in the resurrection to do that. Like, are you still reading about it? Are you still intrigued? I mean, what do you see as your relationship with Christianity now?
There's a fascination with it that I just think is just a natural inclination. I think that part of it, an analogy I've used before is, if I had been raised in a religion that was based on the Lord of the Rings books, I think that I would have been shaped significantly by those books, that worldview, that even if I left it, I think there's this, like, it's such a part of who I am. I think going back and reading them and experiencing them would be something that was a little bit comfortable, but also helps to kind of like, it helps me understand the way that I am. I am the way that I am. I see the world the way that I see the world because of my background. I may not completely agree with all of it anymore. I disagree with most of it, but I would be lying if I didn't say it was an essential part of who I am. So I think that there's always going to be this fascination with Jesus, and I almost feel this compulsion to.
I think we will also skip this. It's again. I'm sure, like, also interesting discussion, but it goes on for a while. But I just feel like this is we'll see what
ultimate meaning way, but in the way that we actually find and build meaning as humans, based on how we interact with our circumstances and how our values interact with our circumstances. Like, that's what these biblical writers were doing all along. Mm-hmm. And suddenly it kind of comes alive to me. Like, I always thought,
I need to know what's being said here. I'm really confused. Okay.
I haven't got any change, because I do wonder, possible vetting.
Okay, wait. I need to know what's going on here. Oh.
A sort of spiritual awakening after that. I mean,
yeah, I'm interested there because he seemed to get into like the question of like, how do you derive meaning? And he seemed to be set. So I'm just interested there. So, and the reality is we're probably skipping over some interesting stuff, but I don't really want to actually ever have to go beyond 2 parts and responding to a video. And unfortunately, by the way, despite it's kind of weird actually, because as I kind of said right at the beginning, for the first 15 minutes, I got no comments on this video. And now so many of you shown up and asked lots of interesting questions. Again, remember to give the video a like before you leave. But so thank you for all the interesting questions. But it means we're possibly skipping through some interesting stuff from the video. Whatever. I would actually recommend, of course, watching the video yourself, because I'm sure there is interesting stuff in it.
He put it in quite uncomfortable terms about like, well, if you look at that, if you look at how close it was, I saw the graphic of how it went just past my head. If you look at that and you're an atheist, you got to start rethinking it. And there is this forgetting of Corey Comparatore, who's the firefighter that the bullet eventually went into and killed.
Right.
But I did think, if you were nearly assassinated, especially if you've already got this sort of egomania
talking about Trump
around you, president of the United States type thing, to have your head turned at the right moment and avoid assassination, I do wonder if maybe that did make him at the very least like seriously consider the possibility of divine watching.
Right.
But I don't know, even then, although I want to grant him that possible space for spiritual growth, I don't know if that develops into
they're talking about whether Trump's a Christian. Of course, the big thing with Trump as a Christian is when he said, and this was way back in 2016, he was like asked, has he asked God for forgiveness? And he was like, I don't think I've done anything that needs forgiveness, which of course, very direct contradiction of a fundamental premise of Christianity right there. So I would not have much confidence that Donald Trump is a Christian. I would say, who the one president who I think is probably a saved Christian is George Bush Jr. And the reason why is because, yes, he was a bad man who did an illegal invasion, but he's also very stupid. And the fact he's so stupid makes me think that he credibly could have just been seriously misled. Because ordinarily I'd be like, well, like a Christian in their right state of mind wouldn't sanction an illegal invasion of a country which they know is going to kill many, many people. That's just not the kind of thing a Christian would do, really, is it? But George Bush is so stupid that I could believe that there were like people around him just like influencing, like, I don't know, I guess so, yeah, sure thing. And I wouldn't think that contradicts the possibility that he actually did sincerely believe in Jesus Christ and Christianity and all that kind of stuff. Someone says, do you think he was genuinely dumb or playing up a character for the Reeves? I genuinely think he is dumb. That is my take. I don't think he's like smart deep down. I mean, I'll say, I don't think like when I say he's like dumb, I'm kind of exaggerating. I'm saying he's like dumb for like a guy who was the president. He was dumb. Like I'm not saying like he was literally like full on idiocracy or whatever. But I'm just saying like I don't think that he's some like genius mastermind or anything. And so like for example, like in contrast to like Dick Cheney, obviously knew what he was doing. Everything was very intentional. But I was going to say something else about. What was I going to say? Junior dumb. Oh, I'm annoyed. Do I think George Bush is genuinely dumb? Oh, sorry. And the other thing I was going to say, and this is like something which in some sense speaks to him being smart, but I also think this again makes me think he might be a Christian, is when he had that Freudian slip where he said, how dare Putin invade Iraq? And then like everyone's kind of like, and then he went like, Iraq too. Like he just said that. I think like my suspicion is that George Bush knows that he was taken advantage of as president. I genuinely believe that George Bush regrets his presidency. And that's another reason why I don't think he was just playing a character. I don't believe like it's literally like, I mean, let's bloody watch it. Wait, I'm gonna have to, okay, if I do this, what happens? Okay. Wait. Here it is. I'm not like crazy, am I? So wait. Okay. George Bush, the Bushmeister.
Contrast. Russian elections are rigged. Political opponents are imprisoned or otherwise eliminated from participating in the electoral process. The result is an absence of checks and balances in Russia and the decision of one man to launch a wholly unjustified and brutal invasion of Ukraine. Iraq. Anyway.
That's so. It's the fact, like, one, he just accidentally said Iraq. Like, that tells me on some level, like when I see that, and I'm not going to kind of like one of those like body language experts, but my reading of like that footage is he knows that invading Iraq was a bad thing to do. It was like the way he like leans and he's like saying like this was an evil, wholly unjustified invasion of Iraq, and then he literally, and like I mean I shouldn't even have to like do the body language because then he literally says Iraq too. And I don't know, like to me, this like I'm just like 100% team George Bush knows that what he did was evil. And I think also it's probably the case that he's like aware that if he really pushed back against it, the CIA would like kill him or something. So I would say he's probably kind of stupid and he's probably a coward. And he's not the kind of person who's like willing to like properly take a stand for what's right. But again, being stupid and taken advantage of and being a coward, neither of those two things preclude you being saved as a Christian. So I think that he's probably going to be a little bit sheepish in when he stands before Jesus, but I think he's in with a serious shot of being all right. Now watch this drive. Okay, can I do it? Okay, share. Oh, I don't really like to have to stop sharing the screen. I wish I could just like switch. That'd be easier. Okay. Anyway, so okay, let's
like it's easier for a rich man to
I don't know if we're gonna get there.
All of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But and so it's like it's a crude tool as
Right.
you put it. And if you just look at the way that one does wonder, I always thought of doing like skits where you sort of put Jesus in the modern day and see how he would actually react, like the sort of this strange juxtaposition of the Christian attitude you're
Are you working super hard to make your business? I'm talking about something different, something
supposed to have, and what Jesus was actually all about. Because some of his teachings I do think are difficult and maybe inapplicable. I had this idea of him like walking through central London or something, and somebody like comes up to him, says, "Sorry, have you got any change?" And the disciples would go, "Sorry, mate, we haven't got any change." And he goes, "Brethren, when one is in need, if you do this to the least of these, you do it to me." So it's like, Matthew, grab the purse and give him some money. Anyway, as I was saying, and then another person comes up, "Have you got any change, mate?" And they're like, "Oh, we just get it." And he's like, because one person is in need, because you've helped one, does that lessen the need to help another? No. Peter, grab your tunic. We're going to give it to him, And then and people just keep sort of coming up, and at the end, someone comes up. "You got any change?" And Jesus is like, "Sorry, mate, I haven't got any change." Because I do wonder, how directly applicable some of these teachings are to the modern world. And so it's kind of easy to say,
This is a fair point, but let's be honest, I do not have time to get into it.
Christian nationalism isn't Christian. Jesus would never abide by Trump. But it's difficult to imagine what Jesus would say about the presidency of a transcontinental republic in general anyway, right? So I always find it very difficult to make those kinds of claims.
Well, and I think that's one of the reasons that I think this is, back to the idea of like, why is it so fascinating?
Mm-hmm.
Because when you really appreciate the context for what this person was operating in, and you think about that for every scripture, the idea that like, oh, this makes so much more sense, not as some prophecy for current times, but it was a rhetorical exercise for what they were dealing with.
Mm-hmm.
And it's to me, the Bible actually becomes more meaningful in one sense, maybe not in like a ultimate meaning way, but in the way that we actually find and build meaning as humans based on how we interact with our circumstances and how our values interact with our circumstances. Like that's what these biblical writers were doing all along.
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly it just...
Okay, I actually didn't think that was particularly interesting. So we will, even though like some of that was interesting, whatever, I'm going to just finish up with this.
Appreciate it. And I appreciate you taking the time to spell out some of your beliefs. I mean, like I say, it's perhaps that uncomfortable thing 5 years ago, whenever it was that you decide you want to do this, because it's not the most user-friendly topic in the world for a lot of people. But at the same time, you want to be open with people, and it feels a bit weird to, if you're going to let people into any degree, this is such a big, important part of your life. You kind of have to let it be known. And hopefully in those 5 years, you felt like that was worth doing.
Yeah, I think so. I think the real struggle at this point, I have no regrets about having told the story and being honest about it. I think that the struggle is, what's the net good of me talking about these things?
Yeah, right.
Because I think that, and this is something I've been thinking about more recently, because there are some people I think that I don't want to disrupt. If their faith is working for them, I'm not interested in disrupting that just because I might believe that it's not true and that there's some sort of delusion.
Okay, and again, this is also like a perfectly interesting discussion, but I think, as I've been heavily implying, we are, I don't see the point in like pushing to have this go on longer than it typically would. I mean, in theory, it's always supposed to be an hour and 30 minutes. In reality, it's not at all uncommon for my videos to go longer than an hour and 30 minutes. I mean, when you look back, like most of my videos there was one that was like, there was one that was like a bang on an hour and 30 minutes. That's really interesting. Either way, yeah, I could make this 5-10 minutes longer, maybe respond to a bit more. But at the end of the day, I think this like latter stuff they're talking about, man, this is boring. Alex generally is, though. I don't know if I'd say he's like boring. I would say that occasionally he over explains things but again, the problem is like, who am I to talk? Remove the beam from my own eye. I don't know if I quite over explain things in the same way. I like to think I don't fully, but whatever. I wouldn't say it's too boring. What I would say, of course, is that from the perspective of me as someone who's responding to this, again, I'm not like here like, oh, I'm debunking him. Like, that's kind of stupid. This is just like a guy talking about his own personal experience. But like, as someone who's mostly interested in like hearing the things they have to say as it's relevant to Christianity and the truth thereof, there's not been like a huge amount to respond to here. And I would imagine that these kind of sections that I have, the sections that make up literally like the last 40 minutes of the video are not as filled with that kind of argumentation, which is kind of why we skip through them a fair bit and spent a lot more time on the earlier sections, and of course a lot of time responding to comments instead of what was in the video. But yeah, we will now go away to part. I will, again, just to remind you guys that if you do the likes and all that kind of stuff, it does help with the channel. And I don't know. I mean, I'm not going to entirely sure what extrinsic reasons there are why you should be particularly invested in this channel. Who knows? Maybe someday this will get big enough that we can have a conversation with Alex O'Connor, and we can tell him. We can be like why I left atheism. Rom 510. I had actually never heard of him until this reaction/response. He's interesting. The interesting thing about Alex O'Connor is he occasionally seems to be on the brink of becoming Christian. That's the most interesting thing about him. Well, not the most, but it's like he's very different from your typical like atheist YouTube person, because he seems very willing to take Christianity seriously, to his credit. So She Vertica says, could we get like top 1 to 3 evidence for Bible/Christianity from your opinion? Not off the top of my head, and not right now after I've just said I'm going to leave, but like certainly an understandable topic that you would like me to touch on from your perspective, and I don't know, at some point maybe I can try and put that together for you, just for you. All right, bye everyone, and I will see you all next week. Again, at some point I'm going to start doing these twice a week, because I really need to start doing that if I want to actually be meaningfully on my grind. Also, I have plans for shorts. That's what I'm going to say. So just watch this space.